I thought we were just visiting new friends, a simple family getaway. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. Little things at first, then much worse. Now I wonder, how did we end up here, trapped in their twisted game? And why didn't I trust my instincts sooner? It all started when Louise and I decided to take Agnes on a much-needed vacation to Italy. I was hoping the trip would break us out of the rut we had fallen into back home in London. Things hadn't been easy between us. I'd recently lost my job. This trip was supposed to be our way to hit reset. When we first arrived, everything seemed perfect. The sun, the scenery, it all felt like the escape we needed. But then we met them, Patty and Sierra. There was something off about them from the beginning. I can't put my finger on it, but I felt it right away when Patty came over to me casually asking for my sunbed. It was like he was pushing his way into our space. Things took a turn when Agnes lost her toy, Hoppy. Patty and Sierra showed up again, returning it, and introduced their son, Ant. They were friendly. Too friendly, really. Patty was always smiling, always full of energy, and I remember thinking that it was almost forced, like there was something lurking behind that enthusiasm. Patty was constantly talking about how happy he was, how his life was perfect. Meanwhile, I sat there feeling the weight of my failures. I started wondering if maybe he was right. Maybe we were too serious, too stiff. I remember when Agnes asked if she could go play with Aunt Louise and I exchanged glances, both of us unsure. There was something about Ant that made us hesitate. He was quiet, distant. Patty had mentioned earlier that Ant was born with an unusually small tongue, which made it difficult for him to speak and connect with other kids. That night, Patty, always full of energy, couldn't stop smiling. He had this way of making everything feel light, even when it wasn't. Not long after we returned home to London, Louise mentioned we'd received a letter from Patty. He wrote about how much they missed us, and he invited us to visit for a weekend at their farm. I immediately thought it was a great idea. We needed something to break the monotony. Louise, though, was more cautious. She pointed out that we barely knew Patty and his family. After some thought, we agreed. Maybe a change of scenery would do us good. Their farm was far from London. When we finally arrived, Patty and Sierra were as welcoming as ever, practically bouncing with excitement. Their energy was infectious, but after hours on the road, all I wanted was to relax. Once again, Patty was in full showman mode, presenting us with blood oranges from Italy and proudly announcing that he had sacrificed the best goose from the farm in our honor. Then came the main course, blood orange goose, a family tradition, apparently. He insisted that Louise take the first bite, even though she had clearly mentioned at the retreat that she was vegetarian. I saw the discomfort in her eyes, but she played along, not wanting to offend. It was awkward, but nothing major happened. After dinner, I needed some air. I stepped outside, trying to clear my head. That's when Ant appeared, struggling to say something. His frustration was palpable, and for a moment I felt sorry for the kid. As we prepared for bed, we found a stain of dried blood on the mattress. It was unsettling, but we brushed it off, thinking the room hadn't been used in a while. That's how I handled everything during this trip. I brushed it off, convinced myself that nothing was out of the ordinary. The next day was when things really started to get strange. We decided to go on a hike with Patty and his family. It was supposed to be a simple walk, but as usual with them, it didn't turn out that way. While we were all gathered around a campfire, sipping coffee, Agnes complained that Ant wasn't letting her play with him. Before I could even react, Patty jumped in, forcing his son to play with her. I saw the discomfort on Louise's face. It was clear she wasn't happy with how Patty was treating his son. But I stayed quiet. I didn't want to make things more awkward than they already were. Not long after, Louise started feeling a pain in her neck. Of course, Patty, being a doctor, jumped in with his own solution. He suggested cold water therapy. We all went down to the river, and that's when we noticed a strange scar on Sierra's abdomen. When we asked about it, she just brushed it off, saying she'd fallen off a ladder while picking apples. I didn't believe her. Eventually, everyone jumped into the water, even though Ant clearly didn't know how to swim. Louise was hesitant at first, but after some coaxing, she jumped in too. For a brief moment, it felt like we were all just enjoying the day. Louise suggested using her neck pain as an excuse to leave, and honestly, I was tempted. But before we could act on it, Sierra invited us to a special dinner that night, mentioning that a local hunter, Mike, had prepared a meal for us. We ended up agreeing to go. When we arrived at the restaurant, Patty revealed that we'd be the only guests. Louise reminded them that she was vegetarian, and thankfully, they offered her a seafood dish instead. Meanwhile, back at the house, the kids were playing hide-and-seek with the babysitter. Ant showed Agnes a collection of watches that belonged to Patty. I wasn't there, of course, But later I'd find out that during the game, Anne also showed her the marks his father left on him when he hit him. At the restaurant, things took an uncomfortable turn when Patty and Sierra started sharing intimate details about their relationship, talking about how they'd been together for 17 years and still had a very active sex life. Later that night, when we returned to the house, things escalated. Louise found Agnes missing from her bed. After a frantic search, she discovered her in Patty and Sierra's room, fast asleep. That was it for Louise. She grabbed Agnes, packed our things, and insisted we leave. I agreed, though part of me felt guilty. We were leaving in such a rush. As we drove away, Agnes started crying about her stuffed toy, Hoppy, which we had left behind. She became so distressed that we had no choice but to turn back. When we returned to Patty's house, Louise explained that she had found Agnes in their bed and that it made her uncomfortable. Sierra then shared something that caught us off guard. She and Patty had once had a daughter, Mary, who passed away at just 12 weeks old. Sierra said that when she heard Agnes crying, her maternal instinct kicked in, and she brought her to their bed to comfort her. It was a heartfelt apology. Agnes, on the other hand, didn't want to leave. She had grown attached to Aunt and felt like she needed to help him in some way. So, we stayed a bit longer. The kids spent their time painting, and during that, Aunt tried to communicate something to Agnes. He wrote down a message, but she didn't understand it. When she told Louise about it later, she dismissed it as just scribbles, but the truth was, Aunt had swallowed the note out of fear, making sure no one would ever read it. As we walked, Patty took the opportunity to talk to me, and it was the first time I saw something shift in his demeanor. He brought up the argument Louise and I had, saying he overheard it. He claimed to understand how tough it was to deal with infidelity, though I insisted it wasn't that, just a few texts. But Patty encouraged me to let go of whatever emotional baggage I had. We ended up in a secluded spot, and Patty suggested we scream as loud as we could, like it would somehow release everything. So we did, together. We shouted into the void, until I felt a strange sense of relief, even happiness. It was like Patty had this hold over me, and for a brief moment, I let go of all the tension. Back at the house, things took a strange turn. Louise accidentally cut her hand while preparing food. Normally, I would have been concerned, but with Patty around, I didn't think much of it. After all, he was a doctor, right? But then, out of nowhere, Patty casually admitted that he wasn't actually a doctor. We were confused. He had told us in Italy that he was. When we confronted him, he laughed it off, saying it was a joke, but there was something in his tone that didn't sit right with me. Later, the kids wanted to show us a dance they had been practicing, but it didn't go as planned. Aunt struggled to keep up with the music, and Patty's frustration boiled over. He made them start over repeatedly, his voice growing harsher each time. Agnes started to feel uncomfortable and refused to keep dancing, which only made the atmosphere more tense. We all started drinking to ease the awkwardness, and before long, Patty had passed out. Louise took that as the perfect opportunity to suggest we leave. Things had gotten way too strange, and she was right, we needed to go. But I was still tipsy and convinced we should stay a little longer just to make sure everything was okay. That's when Sierra approached Louise, quietly warning her that it would be dangerous to leave before Patty woke up. She said we needed to keep up appearances for our sake and for Aunt's. There was a hint of fear in her voice that unsettled me. Meanwhile, Aunt was acting on his own. He stole his father's keys and led Agnes to the basement under the pretense of playing. Once there, he showed her something disturbing, suitcases belonging to previous guests and old photographs. It was then that Aunt revealed a dark secret. Patty wasn't his real father. His real dad had been murdered, his tongue cut out. Patty and Sierra were somehow responsible for the disappearances of multiple families. Thinking quickly, Aunt told Agnes to take pictures with her phone. They managed to leave the basement unnoticed, but when they returned, Patty was already awake. He asked Aunt for a hug, and Aunt, playing along, discreetly slipped the keys back into Patty's pocket. Everything seemed to carry on as usual, but we all knew something had changed. Later, Agnes came up with a perfect excuse to step away. She said she had just gotten her first period and needed to go to the bathroom. Once there, she showed Louise the pictures she had taken. Louise was alarmed, but kept her cool, telling Agnes to stay calm and act like everything was fine. We couldn't risk raising any suspicion. When Louise and I reunited, we agreed that we had to act normal, like we didn't know anything. But Agnes was too scared to keep pretending, so we came up with an excuse. Agnes was feeling anxious because of her period, and we needed to leave immediately. But just as we were about to leave, we discovered that one of the tires was flat. I was ready to call for roadside assistance, but of course, Patty insisted he could fix it. He did, and once the tire was changed, we were finally ready to leave. That's when Agnes remembered her beloved stuffed toy, Hoppy. We spotted it on the roof, torn apart. Exhausted and disturbed, Agnes didn't care anymore. She just wanted to leave. As we said our goodbyes, Patty made a comment that sent chills down my spine. He hoped we'd keep in touch, but there was something in his tone, something hovering between sincerity and sarcasm, that made me doubt we'd ever hear from him again. As we stood by the car, ready to leave that nightmare behind, Louise bluntly told Patty that we wouldn't keep in touch. She admitted that our marriage was falling apart, and that her infidelity wasn't something we could easily overcome. I was surprised by her honesty in that moment, but what shocked me even more was the strange look of satisfaction on Patty and Sierra's faces. It was as if they thrived on the chaos between us. Just as we were about to cross the fence and finally leave, something terrible happened. Patty threw Ant into the water. Ant couldn't swim, and without thinking, I jumped in to save him. But it was a trap. We were pulled back to the house, and suddenly, everything became clear. Patty explained to us that we were part of a twisted game, and that now, as we spend our last minutes, we have to transfer all our savings to them, or they will cut out Agnes's tongue. Patty admitted that they kept Ant because Sierra had always wanted a child, but they could never have one of their own. Things escalated quickly. Patty grabbed Agnes and was about to inject her with something, but Louise, acting out of sheer desperation, attacked him with a knife she had hidden. Chaos erupted. In the confusion, we managed to lock Patty and Sierra behind a padlock, but our escape wasn't that simple. Mike the Hunter showed up, and we barely avoided his gunfire. We ran back to the house, searching for a way out, but when we tried to call for help, the phone lines were cut, and the power went out. I panicked. Louise snapped at me to calm down. She reminded me that we had to be smart about this. We hid the kids in a closet, giving them strict instructions to stay silent until we returned. Patty, furious at what we had done, stormed into the house with Mike and Sierra. They were armed, ready to finish us off. The confrontation was inevitable. Patty chased after Louise, but she surprised him, managing to injure him and escape. Meanwhile, Sierra, completely unhinged, was searching for the kids. In the chaos, Ant had a coughing fit, which gave away their hiding spot. Patty, guided by the sound, opened the closet, but instead of finding the children, he found the phone we'd used to calm Agnes. Before he could react, Louise appeared out of nowhere and threw acid on him. His screams echoed through the house. While Patty was writhing in pain, Sierra rushed to help him, trying desperately to wash the acid off, but the damage was already done. In another part of the house, Mike had cornered me. He lifted a sharp mirror, ready to stab me, but Louise saved me just in time, landing a blow so hard that Mike collapsed lifeless. The kids tried to escape through the roof, but Sierra appeared at the window. In a final act of courage, Louise shoved her, and she fell to the floor. I sacrificed myself by jumping down to set up the ladder, but I ended up fracturing my leg. I managed to get the ladder in place, and we all climbed down. Our brief relief was shattered when Patty appeared, holding Agnes in his arms. He looked at his dead wife and, in a chilling voice, said that since we had taken Kiera from him, Agnes would be his new Kiera. But Agnes, ever resourceful, had kept the sedative that was meant for her. She injected Patty with it, and as he weakened, Louise and I pointed a gun at him. But we didn't pull the trigger. As we turned to leave, Ant, filled with rage, grabbed a brick and, in a fit of fury, made sure Patty was no longer recognizable. It was his final release, all the anger and fear he'd held inside. And just like that, we walked away, shocked and forever changed by everything we had been through. That's how it ended. An escape, but not without scars. And the worst part? Even as we drove away, I couldn't help but feel like it wasn't really over.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe for more content like this.